If you tell a 62-year-old American to wait until 70 for Social Security without first asking what has to carry the household for those 8 years, you are not giving advice. You are handing out arithmetic without consequences. That is where I want to begin, because most people have been taught to think about Social Security in one of the most misleading ways imaginable. They have been taught to think that the main question is this: what age gets me the biggest check? That is not the main question. The main question is much harder and much more honest. What problem is this benefit supposed to solve inside my retirement, and what will it cost me to solve that problem, one way instead of another? That is the real question. The headline version of the story sounds very clean. Wait until 70, get a much larger monthly benefit, win. And mathematically, there is real power in that sentence. I would be foolish to deny it. A larger inflation, adjusted government, back check for life is an extremely valuable thing. It can reduce longevity risk. It can lower pressure on your portfolio later. It can give a surviving spouse a much stronger income floor. It can function like a surprisingly attractive return on delay. All of that is true. But there is another truth that matters just as much. A good strategy you cannot afford to implement is not your strategy. It is somebody else's. And that is what most people miss when they hear that only a small minority of Americans wait until 70. They assume the public must be irrational. I do not start there when I hear that only a sliver of households delay that long. I do not first think ignorance. I think constraints. I think bridge capital. I think health. I think sequence risk. I think survivor structure. I think a country full of people being asked to admire an answer that many of them were never financially built to execute. That is the real story. The source document you gave me sees that. Clearly, it starts from the attention-grabbing claim that most Americans ignore, the number one Social Security advice, but then immediately turns the frame around and says, the real issue is less a behavioral problem than a constraint problem. In other words, many households are not refusing smart advice. They may simply lack the assets, cash flow, health outlook, or retirement structure needed to make that advice work safely. Faye file a site. Faye turned 65, file 0 Faye. That is exactly right. And once you see that, the whole conversation changes. You stop asking what age sounds smartest in a magazine article. You start asking which claiming strategy actually fits the architecture of the household. That is a much more adult conversation. So let me give you the real framework the way I think it should be given. Not as a slogan, as a sequence. There are 5 things Social Security can do for you. It can maximize your monthly income later. It can maximize total lifetime income under a long life. It can protect a surviving spouse. It can reduce pressure on the portfolio in later decades, or it can relieve pressure on the household immediately. Those are not the same objective, and the claiming age that serves one objective best may be a poor choice for another. That is why the blanket answer fails, because households are not solving the same problem. Let us begin with the first mechanism. I call it the delayed credit engine. This is the part that gets all the headlines because it is visible and mathematically attractive. If your full retirement age benefit is $2,000 per month, taking it at 6 the 2nd of May, reduce it to roughly $1,400 a month. Wait until 70 and it can rise to roughly $2,480 a month. That is not a small difference. That is a 77% increase in monthly income. It is real, it is powerful, and unlike market returns, it is built into the structure of the system itself. The source text walks through exactly this example to show why delaying can be such a compelling idea in the first place. Faye file a site, Faye turned 65, file 0 Faye. That is why I get impatient with people who pretend the delay argument is fake. It is not fake. It is powerful. A larger guaranteed inflation-adjusted benefit is a serious asset. It is not just a bigger check. It is a stronger floor under your old age. It is a stronger defense against living longer than your assets expected. It is a stronger source of certainty in a life stage where certainty becomes extremely valuable. If all you cared about was maximizing that later monthly floor, the delayed credit engine would deserve enormous respect. And many experts are right to emphasize that point. But that is only one layer. The delayed credit engine is attractive precisely because it gives you more later. The question the headline skips is obvious once you slow down enough to ask it. What carries you until later arrives? That brings us to the second mechanism, the bridge capital problem. This is the part that gets people hurt. If you delay Social Security from 62 to 70, the check gets larger. Fine. But something has to pay the bills while you wait. Either you keep working, or you use other income, or you draw from assets, or you lower spending hard enough that the household can survive the gap. That is the bridge, and the existence or absence of that bridge is what divides elegant theory from real planning. The source document is excellent here. It says the actual recommendation is not everyone should wait until 70. The recommendation from serious research is delay if you can afford to delay and if it fits your plan. That single phrase changes everything because it makes clear that the strategy depends on funding the gap in a sustainable way, Fay Filicite Fay turn 65 file 0 Fay. That is the whole game. People hear the better check at 70 and admire the destination. They do not study the bridge. That is how retirees get hurt. A person with a large portfolio, solid health, other income, or the ability to keep working can often treat the bridge as a manageable engineering problem. A person with modest savings, no pension, no meaningful outside income, and fading work capacity cannot. For the second person, wait until 70 is not a strategy. It is often a demand that the household live inside a stress level. The household was never built to withstand. That is not optimization. That is pressure disguised as wisdom. Suppose the household retires at 62 and has real expenses that need to be met every month. Rent or housing, food, insurance, transportation, utilities, medical costs that have a way of getting more interesting, not less, as the years pass. If Social Security is not turned on, then the money must come from somewhere else. This sounds obvious, yet it is astonishing how many people discuss claiming strategy as though the gap years occur in a vacuum. They do not. They occur inside actual lives, lives with uncertainty, lives with fatigue, lives with spouses, lives with health questions, lives with market risk. That is why the bridge is everything. Now we move to the third mechanism, the sequence of returns trap. This is where a mathematically strong delay strategy can become strategically dangerous for the wrong household. The source text gives a very useful example. It asks us to imagine someone retiring at 62 with a $350,000 portfolio and needing $40,000 per year to live. If that person delays Social Security until 70, then for 8 years the full $40,000 must come from the portfolio, which implies an 11 to 12% withdrawal rate. The file is right to call that extremely risky because now the portfolio is under huge strain at exactly the moment when early market losses can do the most damage. Fay Filicite Fay turn 65 file 0 Fay. That is the part people need to feel, not just understand abstractly. A retirement portfolio is not merely a pile of assets. It is a timing machine. If the first years of retirement are good, you can get away with far more. If the first years of retirement are ugly, the same withdrawal plan can become fatal. That is what sequence risk means. Losses early are not just losses. They are losses while withdrawals are also happening. You are not only watching the account drop, you are selling pieces of the account while it is already wounded. That changes everything. A person drawing 11% or 12% from a modest portfolio in the first 8 years of retirement is not carefully optimizing. He is hoping the market is unusually cooperative, while his whole plan leans on that cooperation. Hope is not a retirement asset, and that is why delaying Social Security can actually increase risk for some people instead of reducing it. The bigger later check is real. But if the bridge requires violent portfolio withdrawals, then the larger later guarantee may be purchased at the cost of damaging or even exhausting the asset base that was supposed to support the whole rest of retirement. That is not automatically worth it, not for every household. Now imagine the same person instead claims at 62 and receives, say, $18,000 per year. Now only $22,000 has to come from the portfolio instead of $40,000. The source material makes exactly that comparison. In that second case, the withdrawal rate drops closer to 6%, which may still be elevated but is vastly more survivable than the earlier example. The core lesson is that a smaller Social Security check now can protect a modest portfolio from being forced to carry too much too early. Fay Filicite Fay turn 65 file 0 Fay. That is a huge insight because it teaches the real principle. The objective is not to maximize one benefit in isolation. The objective is to make the entire machine work. If taking Social Security earlier lowers strain on a vulnerable portfolio enough to improve the overall sustainability of retirement, then an earlier claim can be a smarter move than a later claim, even if the later check looks better on paper. That is not anti-math, that is system thinking. Now let us move to the fourth mechanism. I call this one longevity insurance. This is the most serious argument in favor of delaying, and it deserves respect. The source file is very clear on this point too. It says delaying can be especially powerful for people likely to live a long time, for women on average, for healthy households with longevity in the family, and for households with enough assets to bridge the gap. In those cases, the larger later benefit functions as a hedge against one of the greatest dangers in retirement, living longer than expected. Fay Filicite Fay turn 65 file 0 Fay. That is exactly right. People still underestimate what it means to outlive your own assumptions. Living a long time sounds wonderful until you price it. Then it becomes one of the most expensive gifts a person can receive, because every additional year asks the same question: what keeps paying? Social Security is one of the few income streams in retirement that is both lifetime and inflation adjusted. That is rare, and rare things matter more than people realize. A bigger delayed benefit is not merely a bigger monthly number. It is an income floor that does not depend on the market, does not care whether stocks had a bad decade, and does not require you to keep making portfolio decisions at 87 with the same emotional sharpness you had at 62. That is worth a lot. This is why healthy people with strong family longevity often have a stronger case for delaying. The longer you live, the more valuable the larger later check becomes. The later years of life are exactly where a guaranteed inflation adjusted stream becomes emotionally and financially precious. That is why I would never mock the advice to delay. For the right household, it can be brilliant. The problem begins only when brilliance gets flattened into a slogan and thrown at households that cannot safely fund the path. Now, we arrive at the fifth mechanism, the survivor floor. This is the mechanism the public understands least, and the one married couples ignore at their own peril. The source document explains this well. In a married household, especially where one spouse has higher lifetime earnings, delaying the higher earner's benefit can be much more important because the larger benefit often becomes the survivor benefit. That means the claiming decision is not only about today's joint cash flow, it can shape the surviving spouse's income for years or decades after one partner dies. Felicite Fay turned 65, file 0 Fay. That is an enormous consideration because the widowed household is a strange and often cruel place financially. One person is gone. Some expenses fall, many do not. Tax brackets often get worse, the emotional burden rises, and the household may now depend even more heavily on the surviving guaranteed income. This is why the higher earner's delayed decision can be so powerful. A larger delayed benefit is not just a nice optimization, it can be a form of survivor protection. And once you see that, the couple's claiming conversation becomes much more sophisticated. You are not merely asking, how do we maximize today's household income? You are asking, what kind of floor will remain under the surviving spouse when one of us is gone? That is a much more serious question. Sometimes the answer will still be that both spouses claim relatively early because the bridge is too fragile, health is uncertain, or the portfolio is too small. But many married households, especially those with one clear higher earner, owe themselves a real analysis of the survivor floor before they dismiss delaying as a bad trade. That is where good planning separates itself from casual opinion. Now let me step back and tell you what I think the whole Social Security debate gets wrong. It mistakes one powerful lever for the whole machine. That is the error. Social Security claiming is not a standalone move. It is part of a larger retirement operating system, a system with work decisions, spending needs, portfolio size, tax realities, healthcare timing, Medicare at 65 spousal structure, housing costs, longevity expectations, risk tolerance, all of these things interact. That is why the right claiming age is never just an age. It is an expression of the household's structure. The source text says exactly this in its better moments. It argues that the right question is not what is the best age, but what problem am I trying to solve, and how does Social Security fit with the rest of the retirement plan? Fay Felicite, Fay turned 65, file 0 Fay, that is the adult frame. Not what age wins, but what is this check supposed to do in my life? Do I need it now because my plan does not function without it? Do I want it later because I am trying to maximize longevity protection? Am I protecting a spouse? Am I relieving portfolio stress now or later? Am I bridging from early retirement with assets that are truly strong enough to carry that burden? Those are the questions. And once you ask them, the conversation becomes much smarter. This is also where behavior matters more than the models admit. The source file nods to this when it mentions certainty, peace of mind, and the fact that not everything that matters in retirement shows up cleanly in a spreadsheet. It is right. People do not live inside spreadsheets. They live inside emotions, uncertainty, health events, and changing energy. Fay Felicite Fay turned 65, file 0 Fay, that matters enormously because retirement is not won by elegance alone. It is won by survivability. A strategy can be mathematically beautiful and psychologically impossible. It can be optimal on paper and miserable in life. It can maximize expected lifetime benefit while imposing years of stress that the retiree never wanted to carry. That is why certainty has value. That is why current cash flow has value. That is why sleeping at night is not a joke category. A person who claims earlier and sleeps well preserves the portfolio and lives inside a plan that actually functions may be doing far better than a person who delays for theoretical perfection while growing more brittle every year on the way to 70. That is not anti-intellectual. That is realistic. Now let me say something that will sound harsher than I mean it to, but I think it is true. The real scandal is not that so many Americans claim before 70. The real scandal is that so many households never built enough flexibility to have a genuine choice. That is the deeper national story hiding underneath the headline. The file points in this direction too. It notes that many Americans step away from work in their early 60s with only modest portfolios and few meaningful alternative income sources for them. Social Security is not an optional optimization variable. It is the keystone that makes the whole plan livable. Fay file a site, Fay turn 65 file 0 Fay. That is the part that should bother you. If most households had fat portfolios, generous pensions, low debt, flexible housing costs, and a comfortable bridge, then yes, more of them might rationally wait until 70, but that is not the retirement reality for most people. So when fewer than 1 in 10 delay all the way to 70, I do not hear a nation of people ignoring math. I hear a nation of people revealing how thin their flexibility really is. That is a very different interpretation. And in my view, it is the more honest one. The statistic is not a morality tale. It is a structural signal. Now let me tell you how I would actually think through this decision if I were helping a household. First, I would identify the real objective. Is the objective current relief, later protection, survivor protection, or maximum total expected income under a long life? Second, I would evaluate the bridge. What assets, work income, pensions, or cash flow cover the years before claiming? Third, I would test sequence risk. If the market behaves badly in the bridge years, does the delay strategy still survive? Fourth, I would examine health and longevity, honestly, not emotionally. Honestly. Fifth, if married, I would model the survivor floor then, and only then would I talk about the best age. That is how this should be done, not by worshiping 70 as a sacred number, but by matching the claiming age to the actual problem the household is trying to solve. Now let me speak directly to the person in their early 60s reading or watching a headline like this and feeling secretly judged. Do not let a generic article make you feel stupid for having a life more complex than a chart. You are not wrong because a textbook says the larger later check has more mathematical beauty. You are wrong only if you refuse to understand your own constraints. Honestly, if you have the flexibility to delay, then study delay seriously. It may be one of the best moves available to you. If you do not have the flexibility to delay, then do not ruin the whole plan trying to imitate a household with different resources, different health, different work capacity, or a different marital structure. That would be foolish. There is wisdom in adaptation. And retirement planning is largely adaptation. The source file lands on the same conclusion in its strongest passages. It says the best advice is not wait until 70, but rather to figure out the ideal time for you or your household based on the entire retirement plan and not on one isolated heuristic. Fayful site, Fay turn 65 file 0 Fay, that is the right ending, not because it sounds moderate, because it is true. A person who can afford to wait is likely to live long, wants a bigger lifetime floor, and needs to protect a spouse may very well be wise to delay. A person with modest assets, limited health, immediate income needs, or a bridge that would require dangerous portfolio withdrawals may be wise to claim earlier. Those are not contradictory statements. They are different households, and different households deserve different answers. So here is the final truth. The number one piece of Social Security advice is not wait until 70. The number one piece of Social Security advice is this. Do not optimize the check in isolation. Optimize the household. That is the whole thing. Because retirement is not a problem solved by the cleanest spreadsheet alone. It is solved by building an income structure you can actually carry, a withdrawal structure that does not break under stress. And a claiming decision that fits the life you really have instead of the life a headline assumes you have. That is where the real wisdom is. Not in shouting one age at everyone, in understanding the bridge, the risk, the spouse, the horizon, and the machine as a whole. Once you understand that, the whole conversation gets calmer and far more useful. That is where retirement planning belongs.